So we're here to talk to you about the kind of AI revolution. I know this is kind of a hot topic, and you've probably heard a lot about it at different seminars, other presentations you've probably attended. But before I do so, I just want to remind everybody there is a sign-in sheet that's going around, so feel free to sign in. Before we get started, I just want to make an introduction. So first of all, I have Anna Garcia. She's a director in the Risk Quantification Division at OSFI. The mandate of her team is to assess the evolution of the risks derived from AI, machine learning adoption, and their impact on the Canadian financial industry, as well as to leverage advanced analytics techniques to build models for risk assessment and quantification. Over the last 5 years, Anna and her team have been leading the work to explore how risk environment have been evolving from the use of AI to support OSFI in the providing of guidance and supervision in this space. And then most notably, which I'm sure you're aware of, the team was the lead in organizing the Financial Industry Forum on Artificial Intelligence, co-hosted by the Global Risk Institute in 2022. And this resulted in the writing of a report, The Canadian Perspective on Responsible AI. And then to my further right, I have my colleague, Kirsten Thompson. She's a partner at Dentons Canada, and she's the national lead of our privacy and cybersecurity group. Just going to give a little bit of background on Kirsten, even though I could probably talk about that for a few minutes based on her experience in the sector. But her practice is spanning both advisory and advocacy roles. Kirsten is also a recognized leader in privacy, data security, and data management across a range of different industries, including the insurance industry. So without further ado, I think the first topic that I wanted to talk about is, I think, quite relevant and quite timely, and that was the fall update that was issued by OSFI to its risk outlook for 2024 and 2025. And what was notable about that was obviously AI and the concentration on risks associated with security and integrity. So Anna, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of just as a general nature, kind of the risks that OSFI had in mind in light of this issuance.
Thanks, Derek. Yes, of course. And thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me in this panel. As you are probably aware, AI is a technology that has a transverse impact. It really amplifies a lot of risks because it touches on so many different aspects, not only in the financial industry, but really on every aspect of our life. And I really believe it will transform our lives completely in the next few years. In terms of risks and why we put it out there, I think you can think of AI as amplifying risks. And really for institutions, there are two ways that AI can impact their risk vulnerabilities. One is through the internal use of AI, which can increase risks like model risk or operational risk, even cyber risk sometimes, if you have certain models that are vulnerable for cyber attacks, right? And the other one is through the use of AI by external actors, which can amplify some risks, again, like cyber, because external actors or criminals are now using AI to generate their attacks faster and with a lower cost. Fraud, that's very important for insurance, right? Like all what we've seen with the advent of generative AI and the creation of deep fakes makes it very easy to generate fraud. And then integrity and security, of course, with misinformation and disinformation. These are risks that are also being amplified by the use of generative AI and impacting geopolitical risks. So that's why we put it in the SARO. We think it's very important to raise the awareness of all the possible vulnerabilities that come not only from internal adoption of AI, but also from the external broader use of AI. Derek.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think this is where I'm going to go into a little bit more kind of specifics. Don't want to spend too much time on this because I think probably the audience has heard about these two specific risks probably ad nauseum in this space, but that's explainability and then also dealing with bias and fairness. So I just want to touch upon those. So I also open up the door just to touch upon kind of how OSFI is trying to look at that, how it's considering it. And then also Kirsten, just from a general privacy perspective, feel free to jump in.
Sure, thank you. Definitely, Derek. Explainability and bias are certainly topics that are very relevant when we talk about AI. Just to talk again about the Financial Industry Forum of Artificial Intelligence, these were two of the topics that we discussed in the session with industry and with academia. In terms of explainability, it's very important, and it's very important to create trust. I think in some of the previous talks we heard about being able to understand how the bias comes up. Well, explainability is needed for that. In terms of models, there are different range of inherent explainability for models. There are models that are very transparent and you know exactly why the model is giving you the result it's giving you. And then there are models that are almost like black boxes. If we think of deep neural networks, you really are not able to know what are the inner workings of the model that derive on a particular output. However, if you're going to use that model for a critical use case, it's very important that you know why the model is doing what it's doing. Some examples that maybe are just in another area, but for example, there are models with image recognition that were trained to recognize pictures with a different sport. And so they found that the model was very accurate and it was very good at finding out when someone was playing basketball versus when someone was playing tennis. And when the developers started looking more closely at the inner workings, they found that the model was not really focusing on anything that had to do with the sport. It was really that in the basketball pictures, it was generally black people playing basketball versus in the tennis, it was white people, right? So it's very important, explainability, to create trust and to really understand what the model is doing. There are different levels of explainability, and you have to take into account who needs an explanation, what is the explanation you need, and what is the materiality of the use case. So you probably don't need the same explanation for a model that is proposing the next item you're going to shop for at your grocery store versus a model that is providing credit adjudication, right, or insurance underwriting, or even a model that may be used to determine who is at risk in terms of committing a crime. Like those models need to be explained very, very well to ensure that there's no bias. In terms of bias, I think it's a very important topic, right? Why? A lot of times there's an argument of why is it so important if bias is already present in any human work, right? Like, why is it more important for AI? And I think the difference is the speed and the scope. Like, when there is bias in an AI model, it can get propagated very, very fast, and it can impact a lot more people than if you have bias from one person, for example, underwriting insurance. So very important to be aware of the possibilities of bias and where it can come from. It can come at very different points in the model lifecycle, from the data that you use to the design of the model. And I'll give an example. For example, I know there are some legal claims against an insurer in the US who was providing acute care for patients. And the way they were doing it was proxying the level of care needed based on their historical health spend. And so it turned out that the model was discriminating against people of black color because they didn't have the same health spend as someone that was white that was very sick. And that was not because they weren't in need of the care. It was just because generally they had less money to spend, and so they were spending less. So just some of the ways in which the models can propagate bias, and how even there, designing the model to use that proxy created that idea of bias. You can also have bias in how you use outputs, etc. But in overall, it's very important to be aware of that, and it can cause reputational risk that can then generate financial losses as well. Kirsten, I don't know if you want.
Yeah, I live in the world of privacy. I'll tell you scary stories about cybersecurity later. But privacy deals with a particular type of information, and that's personal information. And some of your businesses will be caught by that. Some of your businesses won't be caught by that. And those of you that are sitting there thinking your business is not caught by that, I probably have a surprise for you. It likely is. To the extent that inferences are made by AI about individuals or their likelihood of claim or their risk of insurability, for instance. That's inferred information about individuals. You've just collected information. Many companies are not aware of that. In terms of bias, the privacy world, well, first of all, explainability, that's a requirement of the Quebec law, and it's subject to guidance materials from the federal regulator. So not yet law. Would be if Bill C-27 passes, and you ignore regulator guidance at your peril. So explainability, that's table stakes. Bias is also another thing, and in the world of privacy, you cannot process personal information unless you have consent of an individual. That can be implied or can be expressed depending upon the sensitivity. However, consent must also be reasonable and for lawful purpose. So if you are violating human rights legislation, have discriminatory outputs, or too much bias creeps into your model, that vitiates the consent. So you are now doing unauthorized processing. Unauthorized processing, collection, use, or disclosure, is a breach. You're now in mandatory breach reporting territory. So this causes a lot of things, a lot of problems other than just reputational harm. If you're in a mandatory breach reporting world, you are also subject to Privacy Commissioner investigation. And the Privacy Commissioner loves making grand announcements about who they're investigating next. And I can tell you within 24 hours of that announcement, a class action is launched.
That's very helpful, and I think that's just another helpful reminder that, coming from both the OSFI perspective, that it's not just that silo. There's also the kind of the privacy side of things that also has to be kept in mind. Just kind of continuing more so on the OSFI side, just wondering if this impacts any new risk pillars, or is that being considered by OSFI?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Derek. I would say that more than creating new risks, AI amplifies risks and creates new interconnections of risks that we've already seen that maybe in the past were not obvious. So, for example, what we're talking about, bias and privacy, right? So before, maybe when you were building a model, you might not have thought about it as much. But again, the impact is so great, and it can be done to a larger population, and you have to be conscious of what could happen. The same goes for the connection with fraud and with cyber or with operational resilience. This technology is new, right? And so we have to be very vigilant in terms of understanding how things can change. The novelty is really in the way the risks are manifested. So, for example, fraud. Fraud is a risk that has always been there. Companies have always been looking to curb fraud and to really identify it and understand it. But now this is coming at a much faster pace with more sophisticated ways of doing fraud. Deep fakes are just an example, right? So in terms of that's my view in terms of the risks. It really amplifies and creates new interconnections or manifestations that maybe we didn't have before. And because we're all learning, I think it's important that we collectively learn together and try to understand the interconnections. If AI is used for insurance underwriting, well, there could be different risks there, and it's important for the different disciplines to talk to each other so that you can really understand how the risks are connecting.
Yeah, and we've seen this, it's tried and true, but for every action, there's an equal and opposite action. It's not just the good guys that are using AI. So I have now seen competing AI cyber attacks back and forth, which you just sort of sit back and watch and see how it ends until someone pulls the plug, because really that's what you do. If you want a very good example, it's not just AI being used to write code to be an attack vector on an existing vulnerability. What I've seen, and I'm sure you've all seen it, is chatbots keep getting taken offline. Why? Because you can use AI to spam the chatbot, which then pushes it outside its learning parameters. And the classic example is when it starts making racist comments and swearing at you. Usually they're fast enough to pull it at that point, but you need to have those guardrails in. So if you haven't had a discussion around like where your parameters are for bias, for adjudication, for risk, then you're going to have AI models that just go off the rails.
That all makes sense, and I think kind of the theme that's coming from this too is it's not a closed model. So I mean that's really what needs to be taken into consideration is that when you implement these AI solutions, they potentially could have some unintended consequences. So really at the outset, it's important to kind of understand what is the intent of the AI that you're trying to implement. What is the reason? What is the business case? And then really trying to understand then what could be the cascading risks that could be associated with that. Just as one kind of final point of this kind of general theme that we've been talking about with risk, talking about guideline V10, and I just wanted to just bring into consideration that I think a lot of times we think about what are our own risks and our own use of AI, but in many cases, I mean, just by a show of hands for your organizations, how many of you actually have your own AI models or are you using a third party's AI model, if using AI at all? So third party? Yeah. Oh, in your own. Okay. Develop. Okay. So just kind of wanted to.
I'm curious.
Yeah.
Of those of you using outside vendors, raise your hand if your vendors are Canadian based.
That's a good point.
2. All right. You've now introduced risk into the system.
So yeah, really, it's kind of a question posed for Anna just to ask about kind of how OSFI is considering that and what really the expectations of industry participants when you're using a third party's AI and kind of what diligence, what should you be looking at, what should you understand?
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, no, it's an excellent point, no? Very, very relevant. So OSFI has guideline E21 on operational risk management and resilience and guideline B10 on outsourcing. And both guidelines, well, especially B10 talks about third-party expectations. And really, in short, the expectation is that any services provided by the institution is still accountable for any services that are outsourced. So you really should be very, very do the due diligence to really understand what are the risks that are coming. And that gets more and more complicated because maybe it's not your service provider. That service provider itself might have another third party, right? It really becomes end party. So really understanding what are those chain of dependencies, ensure the accountability is there at your organization to understand that if you are using a third party provider, the institution is still accountable for that. So how do you prepare for that? Assessing the risk of your third party regularly, understand, know the company that is your third party provider, not only because of the service they provide, but also of their interconnections in the industry. Again, we saw with the issue with CrowdStrike, right? How it can be something of a very different nature that can be affecting your third party provider. So be aware, keep constant monitoring of what's going on. Perform a risk identification and assessment that takes into account what could be the severity of loss from a failure of the third party. Can you substitute that third party? Is it critical for your operations? And what would happen if there's a failure? What is your plan B? What is the concentration risk that is present? Is it the only party that provides the service, and is it providing it to the rest of the industry? What are the data and security controls that are present? Have a business continuity plan and exit contingency strategies. And again, what are the subcontracting arrangements? Do you know them? So know your provider. Also, ensure allowance for comprehensive information. I know that sometimes it's very difficult to get, right? Third parties sometimes say that they can't give you the information because that's their secret sauce, but really be aware, right? So what are you using the service provider for? And if can you get documentation, get it. And if you cannot get documentation, then how do you mitigate that risk of not having it? Ask for the right to commission a third-party audit of the provider. And again, monitor and report, including incident management. It's a constant relationship management. It's not a one-time initial done, right? Like you really have to constantly be seeing how the environment is changing, do the due diligence on an ongoing basis. And the last one, technology and cyber risk, which I'm sure Kirsten will talk about. But again, right, when you bring in a third party, are you aware of their technology and cyber controls? Can you be comfortable that they are at the same standard that you would have them in your organization? So those are some of the points.
The principles in privacy are very similar to that. I would just like to flag, though, and emphasize how much of an ongoing, constant exercise this is. If you don't ask the questions, you are not going to know if your vendors or providers are using AI. Now, obviously, if they're an AI provider, you're going to assume that. But there are many, many other providers that have adopted AI, and unless they have a continuous disclosure obligation, you may not even know. Cloud providers are a perfectly good example of that. Many of them have now adopted AI controls, cybersecurity. If you have not asked or you don't have a continuous disclosure obligation in your agreements, you're probably using AI or your data is subject to AI and you're not even aware of it. The other thing that comes up constantly is the fight between vendors and main organizations or the controller organization about the use of the data. Most AI vendors will want to use the data you provide to train their models. That's fine under privacy law if you are benefiting. If instead they're training the models using your data and probably an aggregate of other people's data to benefit them, i.e. improve the models generally, that's not allowed under privacy laws unless consent is provided. And this gets glossed over all the time. And I would hazard a guess that probably 60 to 70% of the organizations in this room are technically offside privacy laws for allowing that to happen.
So I want to continue just with the guidelines. This will be the last kind of, very kind of dive into any type of kind of regulatory guidelines themselves. But just I think it's topical for kind of what we're speaking about, and that's guideline E23, which is dealing with AI models. And I really kind of have two questions, kind of more pointed at Anna. And just generally, how is OSFI approaching then, just at a high level, the regulation of AI when you're looking at this guideline? And then really kind of the second point is, because this is evolving so quickly ever since issuing the draft, has anything changed where you're now kind of recalibrating maybe from a different perspective or kind of re-looking at any particular matters?
Thanks, Derek. And that's right on point because we are currently working on the finalization of the guideline. So maybe let me just tell you a little bit of the history, right? So Guideline E23 was issued in 2017. It applied to deposit-taking institutions for their capital and risk management models only. And only for those institutions that required approval for capital models. So really, all the other deposit-taking institutions just had to follow the minimum requirement, which was having a model inventory. And of course, they were deemed as best practices. So when we started looking at AI, at OSFI, we really thought, maybe we should have a separate AI guidance. And as we continued the work, talk to the industry, talk to academia, we recognized that the principles for model risk management at a high level would still help manage the model risk from AI. So we decided just to update and increase the scope of the guideline. So the guideline will now be applying to all financial institutions that OSFI regulates, including insurance and pension plans, and to all models. How do you do that? You can only do that through a risk-based approach, because if not, it would be impossible. To your second question, Derek, how have we changed our view? I think we're very conscious that the new models or the AI models are moving very, very quickly, and we really would like our guidance to stand the test of time. So we are principle-based, right? And those principles would be at a high level. Again, I mentioned risk-based because it's the only way you can do the model risk management without a huge overhead. So that means really having a very good risk assessment, including all the different types of risks that could come, as we have been talking: data, privacy, customer, complexity, financial impact. So we're trying to word our final guideline to be able to have that flexibility and that risk-based approach that allows institutions to really manage their risks effectively. We recognize that the more rigid the guidance is, the harder it will be to adapt to this ever-changing and rapidly changing environment. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and seems to be consistent with the principles-based approach that's advocated by OSFI. Just somewhat similar to what we've been talking about, but somewhat transitioning, is just as far as, common criticism with any type of regulation is that regulation potentially can stifle creativity, can stifle innovation. So just wondering how OSFI is trying to manage that balance and Kirsten, I'd also invite you just anything from kind of more of a privacy regulatory perspective too, kind of what you're seeing as far as that balance between trying to ensure there's still innovation, but obviously the other side of the coin is ensuring people are protected.
Well, I don't know that I would look to the privacy regime as Bill C-27 sort of stutters and isn't likely to die in Parliament. But PIPEDA was also, the main federal privacy legislation was also principles-based, and it hung in there pretty solidly for about 20 years. And then technology completely outpaced it. So what I'm starting to see is organizations are now taking their best guess at how to comply with the legislation, which is not great, because they're kind of making it up as they go along. Legislation that is not flexible and forward-thinking ultimately leads to business uncertainty and rogue behaviors, intentionally or otherwise.
That's an excellent point, Kirsten, and one of our challenges, right? Because, again, we want the guidance to stand the test of time. So you want to make it high level, but the more high level you put it, the more room for interpretation there is and the more range of practice. So we really want to try to, one of the things we try to do being principles based is to put the accountability in the institution, right? So again, OSFI will provide guidance, but institutions are accountable to manage their risks. And so giving that awareness of these are the risks you should be looking at is hopefully going to help institutions set up their frameworks. I think finding that balance is very, very hard. And I think one of the ways we're trying to do it is also trying to work with the technology ourselves and using it, right? Being flexible maybe in the types of guidance artifacts we use. So one is guideline, but maybe you have seen some notices. I think we put out a cybersecurity notice recently. So there's different ways that we can provide guidance. We're also trying to engage with industry. We are hoping to have the second Financial Industry Forum on AI next year. So these are ways in which we really try to bring the industry and the regulators together and get those conversations going so that we can help find that balance in terms of how do you provide that guidance and regulation, but not stifle innovation. OSFI is technology neutral. And I think a lot of our guidelines are, right, and principles based. So really just trying to provide the high level aspects that institutions should be aware of and try to attain, but we leave the accountability of the risk management to institutions.
Thank you. This is probably directed a little bit more at Kirsten, but this has to do more in the kind of personal information and kind of privacy side. But there has been obviously a proliferation on your side as well with respect to regulation. Some of the things that just of note are the Privacy Commissioner issued a document called Principles of Responsible, Trustworthy, and Privacy Protective Generative AI Technologies, short title, setting out considerations for the application of key privacy principles to generative AI technologies. And then also the Government of Canada has introduced a proposed AI Intelligence and Data Act, the AIDA, which I think probably a lot of people have been keeping track of, which also would set the foundation for responsible design, development, and deployment of AI systems that impact the lives of Canadians. And so I'm just kind of curious at a high level, just kind of for the insurance folks in the room, just kind of how that legislation could impact them and things they should be considering.
So,
in 2 words.
In 2 words, yeah. We're doomed. We're all doomed.
We need to find Sarah Connor.
It's partly the technology and partly the legislative process moves slowly. So the reality is there is the Artificial Intelligence Data Act, part of Bill C-27, which is sitting at second reading and will probably die in the order paper before it goes anywhere. Now, it was a bit of a Hail Mary attempt. It's a framework. And then it leaves everything to regulation. The phase-in was a 2-year phase-in with regulations to be put forward. So we're talking let's say we get through an election, it's reintroduced, there's a phase in and a voluntary adoption, and the regulations are passed. We're talking 5 years before there's any meaningful regulation of AI in Canada. Given what goes across my desk, just on the cybersecurity side, the Sarah Connor model, not far.
And also just talk about how fast these things evolve, though. So by the time, you just wonder how antiquated potentially things could be.
So I get a lot of questions about, well, then what should we be doing? Because we've got our marketing group and our claims and adjusters and everybody else, they're running around saying we should buy all this stuff. What are we supposed to do if we don't have any guidance? And I say, okay, well, look to the EU AI Act. So that is actually passed. It is not yet in force. It's coming into force over a period of time. But it uses the same principles as ADA. And Canadians are really good at looking overseas saying, oh, that's good. We'll tweak it here and paint it blue and maybe put another paragraph on it and it's Canadian. It's ours. So it's actually the EU AI Act is a good set of principles. It's risk-based. It's principles-based. It starts off with a very handy thing that says really dangerous stuff is prohibited, which, is something I kind of like. And then it triages the responsibilities you have based on the risk that the system imports into whatever it is you're doing and the sector that you're in. ADA roughly parallels that framework. Most international instruments, either official laws or sorts of guidance, use that same approach. So if you're really adrift and don't know what you're doing, look to the EU AI Act and what's going on there. In the privacy sphere, the privacy commissioner's really only gotten their head around ChatGPT and generative AI. It hasn't really looked at other models and the use of personal information in that. And I mentioned one big gap, and that is the use of personal information that you have within the organization for training AI, or your vendors or service providers want to use the data that you've transferred them to them for processing for training their AI. It's very unclear under privacy laws whether you can do that, and if so, how. Now, I'll be frank with you, almost everybody's doing it anyways. Eventually the privacy commissioner will catch up, but it's not really very good at nonlinear business models. It's still living in a world where there is somebody that sells widgets to somebody else. That is not the business model, and that is not the business model in your sector in particular. There are some gotchas in privacy law that I will just flag for you. Where your AI model makes all sorts of predictions about individuals, you are inferring information. That is a collection of personal information. You're subject to privacy laws. If I infer because of your age and your previous claims history, you are likely to be off work for 4 to 6 weeks, I just inferred information about her. I just collected information. The other gotcha on the other side of that is not only are you now collecting information, data subjects have rights. So as an individual, they can ask you to provide either a copy or access to that information. So now you've got to know where this information is to be able to hand it over to them. And that inferred information is often missed. And honestly, most of the access requests I'm seeing now, people want to know what companies think about them.
And I'm just going to put a plug. So we talked about explainability before. Here's where explainability is really needed, right?
And the other thing I see companies do particularly poorly is someone will tell me, okay, you don't have to look at this schedule, this agreement, this whatever. We anonymize the information. It's fine. And I usually say, wait, what? When you anonymize it, what do you do? Well, we take the names out. That, my friends, is not anonymous information. That is de-identified information, and de-identified information is within the regulatory perimeter, which means if you're not using it in accordance with privacy laws, you're using it illegally. And if you are a regulator, federal regulator doesn't really have any powers, but they get very excited about this. Quebec regulator does have powers, and they take the position that they can order you to destroy that. And I've even seen one, and I'm not sure if it was a slip, they believe they can order you to destroy the model. Because it was built using illegally obtained information. So, haven't seen anything actually come through on that, but the privacy commissioners are very aware of this. Also, another gotcha in Quebec, anonymization is set out in their regulations to the privacy laws. So if you hear anybody in your organization saying they've anonymized information, take them to the Quebec regulation and say, here's a step-by-step guide. What are we doing? Because if you are not following that, your information is not anonymous. So think carefully when you start throwing those terms around. And if you are making representations, I see many, many vendors, particularly US-based vendors, that says, then we anonymize your information and we use it for really good things. There's a lot of words in that sentence that you should be asking questions about.
Thank you. I just want to touch upon something that we just really briefly, probably in about the first 10 minutes of the presentation, and that was just collaboration. And I just want to kind of talk a little bit more about that, and as far as kind of what you believe regulators can do as far as collaborating with, most importantly, industry participants, but even academics in connection with the development of AI regulation that is going to be both beneficial for industry, consumers, et cetera.
Thanks, Derek. And I think it fits right after the topic, right? Because, for example, OSFI is not a conduct regulator, so we really don't set expectations in terms of privacy or in terms of customer impact. But this is such a relevant topic for AI that we certainly highlight it as something institutions should be aware of when they are building their models. So it will be in our model risk guidance. In terms of collaboration, I think it's very important that we collectively learn. I really think we're in a place where we really all have to be sharing information. This is new for everyone. I've heard it relate to when automobiles started and how the legislation and regulation of automobiles developed, and it took 60 years almost for really to have like speed limits, different safety controls, and obviously we don't want that to be the case, and this is moving much faster, and hopefully we've learned from the technologies we've seen, but it's really key that regulators collaborate. At OSFI, we generally have touch points with peer regulators. We share information with peers at the Monetary Authority of Singapore, with the Bank of England, with Switzerland. Like, we really value those engagements. And in terms of partnering with industry or talking to industry, again, the FIFI was one. We want to do FIFI 2, but we have different touch points with different stakeholders. Ideally, this collaboration would lead to something concrete, right? Like maybe best practices or maybe advancing the regulation in Canada. And as Kirsten said, that's slow, but we're still hopeful, and so we do what we can to bring about that collaboration. So,
Kirsten, anything to add?
In the privacy and cybersecurity world, it's very similar. There's lots of memorandums of understanding between various international privacy regulators, and all of them are dealing with how to address artificial intelligence. If Canada still lags and you're trying to grapple with this within your organization, look to other authorities. The UK and the EU are being leading. Australia, love Australia, very comprehensible, understandable. They love checklists, but everybody is grappling with the same thing.
I think a good place to end then, as far as kind of the last question, is kind of the classic question of what do you see as being the biggest challenge then with respect to regulation of AI? I mean, I know there's probably a couple obvious ones that we've already touched upon, but just if you could pick a number one topic, each of you, as far as what you think the biggest challenge is to successfully regulate it.
I think I'm going to pick, we talked about the balance, but I think one of the biggest challenges is the skills and expertise, right? Because we are competing for the skill set and the expertise with not only the financial industry, but with all industries, right? So I think it's really important to really develop that skill set, to provide training, to start using it ourselves so that we can understand better the challenges. We've already talked about collaboration, etc., but I would pick skills and expertise as one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I would second that. We can't regulate what we don't understand, and we can't use effectively that which we do not understand. And I'll give you a very good example of this. I work with a very sophisticated organization that has a whole basement full of developers that do nothing but AI, mostly in the machine learning and object detection and object recognition. And I keep saying, like, these guys are great. Can I bring them on stage and we can have a really interesting conversation with them? And the company keeps saying, no, someone will hire them. So they're never let out of their pen.
So that's it for our presentation. So I'm not sure if there's it's good leaving point. But just going to open the floor now for any questions that anybody may have about just anything in general, anything that we touched upon, or anything you've been thinking about with AI, because I know there's a lot of information out there. Of course.
Assuming that C27 doesn't pass, do we expect to see provinces and provincial regulators expanding into that regulatory space, or are they going to take a wait and see approach?
They're currently taking a wait and see approach, although Quebec is charging ahead on its own. No surprises there. Alberta's getting a little restless. They're starting to make inroads in the public sector. It's a very interesting question, for the lawyers in the room, they'll find this fascinating. It's really a constitutional question. Who has the right to regulate AI? Is it is it so important that it needs federal regulation, or is it something that's really of concern to the provinces? Remember those Section 91, Section 92 constitutional debates. So I expect at some point we're going to have to hash this out. The current draft of ADA sort of dances around that to keep it solidly in the federal jurisdiction. I know the provinces, certainly at the public sector government level, are introducing their own sort of regulations, directives to regulate the use by government. It'll be interesting to see how it works out at the provincial and the federal level, and whether you can have coexisting regimes. We don't need sort of another sort of securities patchwork kind of thing, which looks like to be where we're headed.
I would just like to add that, I mean, that's important, right? Like, where is the regulation going to come? But I would say, just as Kirsten said, don't wait, right? Like, there are places that you can look to for guidance on what you should be putting in place. And I think just from the perspective of managing the risks, don't wait for the legislation to be there or the regulation to be there. Yeah.
And just on that, don't forget that the regulation influences behavior, but there's also another much more rapid regulator of behavior, and that is class actions. And we're already starting to see them. In the AI space.
Sorry, just to follow up, it's not working. It's fine. Just to follow up on that question, though, isn't OSFI's E23 model risk and scoping in AI, isn't that moving towards regulation on AI in some form? Like, I'm trying to understand, where does this things land? Insurance is a highly regulated industry, so is it extending that regulation on a sector outside of regulation on this developing?
It's an excellent question. And so maybe to clarify, so E23 will be a guidance on model risk, but it doesn't touch all the aspects that AI touches, right? So OSFI also has an operational resilience guidance. We talked about the third-party guidance. We have a technology and cyber guidance. All of those are relevant when someone is implementing AI or to manage AI risks. I think we don't cover the conduct part because it's not in OSFI's purview. And so that would be more the provincial regulators or FCAC. And so that's where that federal legislation, and I look to Kirsten for more detail, but I think that's the federal legislation would cover all aspects. We cover certain aspects, but not everything.
Yeah, it breaks down. If ADA were to pass at the federal level, it would serve as a framework, either formally or informally, for other jurisdictions, in part because the first thing that happens when the federal government passes a law is that the provinces and government or organizations scream, for Pete's sake, could you make this interoperable? Because nobody wants to comply with, 11 different regulatory regimes.
Yeah. And maybe a little bit of color. So as ADA was being developed, we were also looking to be at least aligned, right? Like, we didn't want to say anything that would be against ADA, just so that if you're compliant with E23, you would, and the way it reads now, as Kirsten said, if it passes, but we're aligned, right? Like, we're not asking for anything more. Like, ADA probably asked for more things because it covers all aspects. So
I see that I'm at 0, actually -2, -3. So that seems to be it. But to the extent that there are other questions, we're going to be around in the reception. So happy to answer any questions that you may have. But just want to thank the panel and much appreciated. Thanks, everyone.